The airplane cabin went silent. Every passenger froze as a tall, stern-looking white man stood up from his seat in first class and marched down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane. He wasn't a flight attendant. He wasn't a passenger either. He was a pilot. His crisp uniform, golden stripes, and commanding posture made it clear, and he was heading straight toward the scene that had already spiraled out of control. "Excuse me," the pilot said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the hum of the engines. "What seems to be the problem here?" All eyes turned. A woman, well-dressed and clearly wealthy, was standing in the aisle, refusing to sit down. Her hands clutched her designer handbag tightly, and her face twisted with disgust. "I will not sit beside her," the woman shouted, pointing at a young black girl no older than 17. The girl wore simple clothes, faded jeans, an oversized hoodie, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her eyes darted nervously, her lips pressed together, holding back tears. "She doesn't belong here," the woman continued. "I paid for this seat, and I refuse to sit next to that." Gasps echoed across the rows. Some passengers whispered in disbelief. Others glared at the woman. A mother covered her child's ears. The young girl shifted uncomfortably, hugging her backpack against her chest like it was a shield. Her knuckles turned white from gripping it so hard. She said nothing. Her silence only seemed to anger the woman more. The pilot paused, his eyes scanning the scene. His jaw tightened. And then, without warning, he stepped closer. What he said next shocked the entire cabin. "If this story touched you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss more powerful stories like this one." And before anyone could process what was happening, the pilot leaned down, looked the poor girl in the eye, and it all began hours earlier, long before the airplane door even closed. The airport was bustling with travelers that morning. People hurried to gates, dragging rolling suitcases behind them. Families hugged goodbye. Businessmen shouted into their phones, and children clutched stuffed animals as they followed their parents. Among them was a girl. Her name was Maya Johnson. She was 17, tall and thin, with braids tied back neatly. Her hoodie was a little too big, and her shoes were worn out, but she walked with quiet determination. Maya wasn't traveling for vacation or luxury. She was on this flight for a reason that mattered more than any vacation ever could. She had been saving every dollar she earned from cleaning jobs, babysitting, and even selling baked goods in her neighborhood just to afford this trip. She wasn't rich, but she had something more valuable than money: dreams. This was her first time on a plane. She clutched her boarding pass nervously, staring up at the departure board to make sure she was in the right place. The letters glowed. Flight 172 to New York City. On time. Maya inhaled deeply. New York wasn't just another city for her. It was a place where she had been invited to an academic program she had worked hard to qualify for. A program that could open doors she had only ever dreamed about. But not everyone around her could see that. To them, she was just another poor girl trying to squeeze into a world that didn't seem made for her. As she reached the boarding gate, she noticed a well-dressed older woman standing nearby. The woman wore a tailored suit, pearl earrings, and shoes that shone like they were polished that very morning. Her luggage wasn't a backpack. It was a glossy leather suitcase that looked expensive enough to pay Maya's rent for months. The woman glanced at Maya once, then quickly looked away, her nose wrinkling slightly, as though the very sight of Maya was offensive. Maya ignored it. She had learned long ago that some people judged her before they knew her. She wouldn't let that ruin her moment. When boarding began, Maya stepped forward with the others. Her seat was toward the back of the plane, next to the window. She smiled to herself. At least she would get to see the clouds from up high. She slid into her seat, adjusting her hoodie. A few minutes later, the older woman appeared, holding her boarding pass, scanning the row numbers. Her eyes widened in disbelief when she realized where she was supposed to sit. "Excuse me," she said sharply to the flight attendant nearby. "This can't be right. You expect me to sit here?" She gestured toward the empty seat beside Maya. "Yes, ma'am," the attendant replied politely. "That's your assigned seat." The woman's face flushed with outrage. She turned to Maya, looking her up and down. There must be some mistake. I can't sit next to her. Maya's heart sank. She shifted uncomfortably, staring at her lap. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the seat, and avoid the stares now directed at her. Passengers nearby were beginning to notice. A man across the aisle frowned. A young mother shook her head disapprovingly. Someone whispered, "Unbelievable!" But the woman only grew louder. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "I did not pay for a ticket to sit next to—" Before she could finish, a ripple of movement traveled down the aisle. The flight attendant had clearly alerted someone. And now, the person everyone least expected was walking toward them, the pilot himself. The murmurs grew louder. Maya's eyes widened as a uniformed figure approached. His expression was unreadable. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. And then, as he stopped right at their row, the woman straightened up proudly, certain the pilot would take her side. But what happened next was something no one saw coming. The cabin was silent. Everyone's eyes followed the pilot as he stood firmly in the aisle, towering over both the angry woman and the trembling girl. His uniform was crisp, his hat tucked neatly under one arm, and the golden stripes on his sleeves caught the overhead lights. He didn't raise his voice, but there was something in his tone that made everyone lean in. "Ma'am," the pilot said, his words slow and steady, "I need you to explain why you're refusing to sit down. This plane cannot take off until every passenger is seated." The woman straightened her back, her chin lifted high. She looked around as if expecting the other passengers to nod in agreement with her, but all she saw were disapproving stares. Still, she pressed on. "I will not sit beside this girl," she said loudly, pointing at Maya like she was pointing at something dirty. "Look at her clothes. Look at her. She clearly doesn't belong in this seat. I paid good money for my ticket. I deserve better than this." A gasp spread through the cabin. Some passengers muttered under their breath. A man in the back shook his head and whispered, "Unreal?" Maya hugged her backpack tighter. Her chest felt heavy. She wanted to vanish, to disappear into the window beside her. This wasn't how her first flight was supposed to be. The pilot turned his head slowly toward Maya. His expression softened, just for a moment, then hardened again as he faced the woman. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "what you are saying is unacceptable. Every passenger on this plane has the same right to be here. That girl bought her ticket, just like you did. She belongs here as much as anyone else." The woman's face turned red. She clutched her handbag closer. "I will not sit next to her. Move me somewhere else. Or move her." A ripple of whispers traveled down the aisle. Passengers leaned toward each other, shaking their heads. A young couple exchanged looks of disgust. Even a child in the row ahead turned around and whispered to his mom, "Why is she being so mean?" The flight attendant stepped forward nervously. "Captain, we can check if there's another seat available." "No," the pilot interrupted sharply. His voice was calm, but it carried authority. "This is not about moving seats. This is about respect." Maya's breath caught. For the first time since the woman started yelling, someone was standing up for her. But then the woman smirked and crossed her arms. "Respect? I've earned my respect. I've worked hard all my life to sit where I deserve. Don't compare me to—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes flicking toward Maya, dripping with disdain. The pilot narrowed his eyes. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but the entire cabin could still hear. "Ma'am, I need you to understand something. This girl you are looking down on may very well surprise you. And right now, you're about to be the one who doesn't belong here if you continue." The woman blinked, stunned. She hadn't expected resistance, not from the pilot. Maya's heart thudded. She didn't know whether to cry, hide, or finally breathe. And just when it seemed like the tension might calm down, another voice came from behind. "Excuse me," said an older man in the aisle seat 2 rows back. He had gray hair, glasses, and a soft voice. He slowly stood up. "Captain, if she doesn't want to sit there, I'll gladly take that seat beside the young lady." Murmurs of agreement spread. "I would too," said another passenger. "She doesn't deserve this treatment." The pilot nodded slightly, but his eyes stayed locked on the woman. "You see, ma'am, this cabin is full of people who will be proud to sit beside her. Maybe you should ask yourself why you don't feel the same." The woman's lips trembled, but she held her ground. "I demand to speak to someone in charge," she snapped. The pilot's expression didn't change. He straightened his shoulders and replied, "You're already speaking to him." The silence that followed was deafening. And then, just as the flight attendant was about to intervene, the overhead speaker crackled. A voice came through, "Captain, we need you back in the cockpit immediately." The pilot hesitated for half a second, his eyes flicking toward the front of the plane. Something in the voice sounded urgent. He gave one last glance at the woman, then at Maya. "This isn't over," he said firmly, before turning and striding back up the aisle. The woman smirked, whispering just loud enough for Maya to hear. "See? He's not even going to stay. You'll never belong here." Maya's stomach twisted. The other passengers muttered angrily, but no one knew what the pilot had just been called for. And then, out of nowhere, the plane jolted violently, hard enough to make drinks spill, luggage shift, and passengers gasp in shock. Hours earlier, before the turbulence and before the shouting match, Maya had been standing nervously outside her home, suitcase in hand. Her mother, Denise Johnson, hugged her tightly on the front porch. "You remember everything I told you?" Denise asked, brushing back a stray braid from Maya's forehead. "Yes, Mama," Maya whispered, fighting back tears. "Stay polite. Stay focused. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You've earned this. You belong in that program just like anybody else." Maya nodded. Her throat was tight. "I'll make you proud." "You already have," Denise said softly, pressing a kiss to her daughter's cheek. "Call me the moment you land, you hear?" "I will." As the taxi pulled up, Maya loaded her worn suitcase into the trunk. She looked back one last time at her mother, standing on the porch, waving with watery eyes. That memory carried her through the long airport lines, the security checks, and even the stares she felt from strangers who judged her clothes and her simple backpack. She had reminded herself again and again, "I belong here. I work for this. Nothing will stop me." But now, as the plane shook violently midair, that confidence wavered. Gasps and cries erupted in the cabin. A baby started wailing. A man grabbed his armrest, knuckles white. Even the rude woman clutched the seat in front of her, her face drained of color. The seatbelt sign dinged on overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen," the intercom crackled with the pilot's voice, steady but tense. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The plane shook again, harder this time. Luggage compartments rattled. A cup of coffee spilled into the aisle. Someone screamed. Maya's heart pounded. She gripped her armrest tightly, her fingers trembling. She glanced out the window, but all she saw were clouds tossing them around like a toy. The rude woman beside her turned pale. She looked terrified now, her earlier arrogance gone. For the first time, she didn't look powerful. She looked human, scared and vulnerable. And then, in a twist no one expected, the woman grabbed Maya's hand. "Don't let go," she whispered shakily, her earlier cruelty drowned out by fear. Maya's eyes widened. She froze. The woman who had refused to sit beside her was now clinging to her like she was the only lifeline. The plane rattled again, harder than before. Passengers cried out. The flight attendants stumbled but held on to the seats. And as the turbulence grew worse, the entire cabin wondered the same thing. Was something seriously wrong with the plane? The plane shook again, harder this time. Drinks toppled, bags slipped from the overhead bins, and nervous screams echoed through the cabin. The hum of the engines roared louder, almost angry, as though the sky itself had turned against them. Maya's hands gripped the armrest with all her strength. Her heart hammered, so loudly she could hear in her ears. Her stomach felt like it was floating, and the seatbelt cut tightly into her waist with each sudden drop. Beside her, the woman who only minutes ago had refused to sit near her was no longer proud, no longer composed. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched Maya's fingers desperately. "Don't let go," the woman whispered again, her voice shaking. Maya stared at her in shock. She hadn't expected this. For so long, people looked past her, judged her, ignored her. And now, The very person who had treated her like she didn't belong was holding on to her like she was the only thing keeping her alive. The plane rattled violently again, and several passengers cried out. Someone prayed aloud, their words tumbling out in desperation. A baby wailed, its mother rocking it quickly. The flight attendants strapped themselves into their seats, their faces tight with controlled fear. Maya swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to pull her hand away, to remind this woman of her cruelty. But another part of her, the part her mother had raised, whispered that this was a moment to show kindness, even to someone who had shown her none. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You rise above it. So, despite her own fear, Maya held the woman's hand tighter. It's going to be okay, Maya whispered, though her own voice shook. The woman's eyes flicked toward her, full of panic. She nodded quickly, almost like a child needing comfort. For a moment, all the walls of pride and arrogance she had built around herself had crumbled. She wasn't rich or powerful in that instant. She was just human. The turbulence lasted several more minutes, tossing the plane around like a toy in the sky. Passengers gasped with each drop, their stomachs lurching. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shaking began to ease. The engines hummed steadier, and the plane leveled out. The intercom clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's calm but firm voice, "we've passed through a rough patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. There is no danger to the aircraft. We are safe." A wave of sighs spread through the cabin. Some people laughed nervously. Others clapped softly, relieved. Maya's muscles ached from holding on so tightly. She released a shaky breath and slowly loosened her grip on the woman's hand. But the woman didn't let go right away. Her fingers lingered for just a moment longer before she finally pulled away, her face flushed with embarrassment. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. The passengers around them, however, were buzzing. "That was intense," someone said. "I thought we were going down." Another muttered, "I'll never complain about turbulence again." The flight attendants moved carefully through the aisles, checking on passengers, reassuring them. One stopped by Maya's row, bending slightly. "Are you both okay?" Maya nodded quickly. The woman nodded too, but didn't meet anyone's eyes. "Good," the attendant said softly, patting the seat. "You were very brave." Her eyes lingered on Maya for just a second longer, as though she knew this girl had been through more than just turbulence today. The plane settled into uneasy quiet. The worst seemed over. Some passengers pulled out books again. Others closed their eyes, and a few whispered prayers of thanks. Maya leaned her head against the cold window, staring out at the endless stretch of clouds. For a moment, she felt small, just a tiny speck in the sky. But she also felt strong. She had faced fear, held steady, and even comforted someone who had hated her. Her phone, tucked into her backpack, buzzed softly with a reminder notification she had set earlier. "Call Mama when you land." She smiled faintly, thinking of her mother's proud face on the porch. But just as her heart began to settle, a new sound broke the quiet. A loud thud echoed from beneath the plane, followed by a shudder that rippled through the cabin. Gasps erupted once again. Passengers clutched their armrests. The pilot's voice returned, firmer now. "Flight attendants, please return to your seats immediately." The attendants obeyed at once, strapping themselves in. The captain didn't speak to the passengers this time, and that silence spoke louder than words. Something was wrong. Maya sat up straighter, her chest tight. She glanced at the woman beside her, who was now clutching her handbag again. Her face drained of color. "What was that?" A man whispered from 2 rows ahead. That didn't sound normal. The hum of the engines grew louder, straining, like the plane was pushing against something heavy. Then, another loud bang rattled the cabin. The entire plane tilted slightly, dipping to one side before leveling again. Gasps and cries filled the air. Maya's stomach flipped. Her hands trembled. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, trying to see what was happening outside, but all she saw was endless white cloud. And then, for the first time since takeoff, the captain's voice came back, but this time It wasn't calm. It was urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts tightly. We are experiencing a technical issue, and I need you to stay calm." A hush fell across the plane. Passengers looked at each other in shock. A baby cried again. Someone whispered, "Technical issue? What kind of issue?" Maya's chest pounded. She thought about her mother's hug, her promise to call when she landed, and her dreams waiting in New York. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the armrest again. And then, as though the sky itself had decided to test them further, the plane suddenly dropped sharply, violently, like an elevator plummeting. Screams erupted, trays clattered, luggage bins popped open, and bags spilled into the aisle. The plane kept falling. The cabin exploded with screams as the airplane plunged sharply downward. Passengers clung to their armrests, their bodies pressing against the seatbelts as the floor seemed to fall out beneath them. Drinks, magazines, and even a pair of shoes flew into the aisle. Maya's stomach shot into her throat. Her hands clamped down on the armrest so tightly her nails dug into the worn fabric. Her chest felt like it was being squeezed, and her ears popped painfully as the plane rattled. Beside her, the woman who had once refused to sit next to her now clutched her arm again, her face ghostly pale. Her lips trembled, and she whispered prayers under her breath, her proud voice replaced by one filled with desperation. The lights overhead flickered. For a terrifying second, the cabin dimmed before buzzing back to life. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the drop stopped. The plane leveled out, steadying in the sky. The screams quieted into whimpers, sobs, and the nervous chatter of passengers trying to catch their breath. Maya gasped for air, her chest rising and falling quickly. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with a shaky hand. Her heart was still racing, but at least they weren't falling anymore. The intercom crackled. Everyone fell silent, waiting. "This is your captain speaking." The voice said, calm but edged with tension. "We experienced a mechanical issue that caused a sudden drop. The aircraft is stable now, but we are assessing the situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. I'll update you shortly." The line went dead. Passengers exchanged uneasy looks. A man muttered, "Mechanical issue? That doesn't sound good." A woman clasped a cross necklace around her neck and whispered, "Lord, protect us." The flight attendants moved cautiously through the aisles, checking on passengers, helping people pick up their belongings, and trying their best to keep everyone calm. One attendant knelt beside a young boy who was crying, handing him a juice box and speaking softly until his sobs slowed. Maya looked around. The fear was still thick in the air, but something else had happened too. People were beginning to lean on one another, offering comfort. Strangers who had never spoken were now sharing tissues, reassuring words, even holding hands. It was strange. Maya thought how danger had a way of stripping away all the barriers between people. The woman beside her, however, sat stiffly, her hands twisting together in her lap. Her eyes darted nervously toward the ceiling, then the floor, then the window. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "I knew I shouldn't have taken this flight. I should have waited for a better one." Maya turned her head slowly, her voice soft but steady. "This flight is as good as any. We're all here together. That has to mean something." The woman blinked, surprised at Maya's words. For a moment, she didn't reply. Then she gave a small, bitter laugh. "What would you know about it?" she muttered. But her voice lacked the sharpness it once had. It was weak, tired, almost scared. Maya thought about her mother's words again. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. You rise above it." So instead of snapping back, she simply said, "I know that sometimes when things get hard, you find strength in the people you least expect." The woman glanced at her, but then quickly looked away, embarrassed. She didn't hold Maya's gaze for long. The plane continued smoothly for a while. The hum of the engines was steady again, and passengers began to settle, though their bodies remained tense. A few people whispered nervously about what the captain had said. "Mechanical issue? What does that even mean?" One man asked. "Could be anything," another replied. "Landing gear, hydraulics, something with the engines." We don't know. Do you think we'll make it to New York? I hope so. Maya pressed her forehead lightly against the cold glass, looking out at the thick blanket of clouds. She couldn't see the ground, couldn't see where they were going, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, to calm her racing heart. She thought of her mother again, standing on the porch, telling her to stay focused. She thought of the program waiting for her in New York, the chance to prove herself, the doors that might open. She wasn't ready to give up. The cabin quieted into a fragile calm. For a while, nothing happened. People shifted in their seats, whispered, tried to distract themselves. A flight attendant passed out cups of water to those who were too shaken to speak. But that calm didn't last. The overhead lights flickered again, dimming before stabilizing. A faint smell, sharp and metallic, spread faintly through the cabin. Some passengers wrinkled their noses. "Do you smell that?" someone whispered. "It's like burnt metal," another answered nervously. The whisper spread quickly. People sniffed the air, their eyes darting nervously toward the ceiling. And then, without warning, a loud alarm blared through the cabin, shrill and piercing. The red emergency light near the cockpit door began flashing. Gasps filled the air. The flight attendants froze for half a second, then quickly moved to their seats, strapping in and preparing for instructions. The intercom clicked. The captain's voice returned, louder this time, firm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've detected smoke in the forward cabin. We are trained for this situation, and I need everyone to remain calm and seated. Follow all crew instructions." Smoke. The word rippled through the cabin like electricity. Passengers' eyes widened. Some began to cry. Others grabbed their seat belts tighter, as though holding them would somehow keep them safe. Maya's heart slammed in her chest. She glanced toward the front, where a faint haze was beginning to creep under the cockpit door. The woman beside her let out a shaky sob. Her hands trembled as she clutched her handbag tightly to her chest. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "Not like this." Maya swallowed hard. Her own fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she remembered again what her mother had said. She turned to the woman, her voice firmer this time. "We'll get through this," she said. "But we have to stay calm. Everyone does." The woman looked at her, eyes wide with panic. For once, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as tears rolled down her cheeks. The smoke thickened slowly, faint but noticeable. The flight attendants' voices rose above the alarm, giving instructions. "Remain seated. Stay calm. Keep your seatbelts fastened." The captain's voice came again, cutting to the panic. "We are preparing for an emergency landing. I repeat, we are preparing for an emergency landing." The words dropped into the cabin like heavy stones. Emergency landing. Passengers gasped. Some cried openly. Others whispered prayers or clutched the hands of strangers beside them. Maya's own stomach clenched. She gripped her backpack again, holding it tightly to her chest. She thought of her mother. She thought of New York. She thought of everything she still wanted to do, everything she still wanted to prove. And then, as the plane tilted downward and the ground finally began to peek through the clouds below, one thought filled her mind, loud and clear. Would they even survive this? The airplane grew quieter than it had ever been. The hum of the engines filled the silence. But inside the cabin, everyone sat stiff, waiting. The racist passenger who had caused commotion now shifted in her seat, clearly shaken by the pilot's words in the previous chapter. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag tighter. She had not expected the pilot himself to come out of the cockpit and confront her behavior, but that wasn't the end. The pilot, standing tall in his uniform, his captain's hat still firmly on his head, now fixed his sharp eyes on the passengers. His voice carried a weight that made even the flight attendants step back a little. "You need to understand something," he said firmly, looking directly at the racist woman. "On this plane, no one is more important than anyone else. Money, skin color, status, it doesn't matter here. Safety, respect, and humanity matter, and I will not allow anyone to ruin that balance." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, as if she wanted to argue, but the fear of being thrown off the flight silenced her. She adjusted her scarf nervously and turned her eyes to the floor, too ashamed to meet his stare. The little black girl, sitting quietly in her seat with her worn backpack resting on her lap, glanced at the pilot with wide eyes. For the first time since boarding, she felt truly safe. It wasn't just that someone had defended her. It was that someone so powerful, the leader of the plane, had done it. She clutched her backpack closer to her chest as though it were a shield, her small fingers trembling but her heart swelling with cautious hope. The pilot bent slightly, softening his expression when he looked at the girl. "Are you all right?" he asked in a gentle tone that contrasted with the commanding voice he had just used. She nodded shyly, whispering, "Yes, sir." But the truth was, she wasn't fully all right. She still felt like everyone's eyes were on her, weighing her down, reminding her she didn't belong among people who could afford expensive tickets. She still felt the sting of being unwanted. The pilot straightened again and looked at the cabin crew. "Make sure she's comfortable. If she needs anything at all, she gets it first." His words weren't loud, but they carried authority that left no room for argument. The racist woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she muttered, her voice rising. "She's not. She doesn't deserve." The pilot raised his hand sharply and the woman froze. "One more word," he warned in a voice so sharp it cut through the air, "and I'll personally ensure you don't remain a passenger on this flight." The woman's mouth snapped shut. She sank back into her seat, glaring at the girl with quiet resentment, but too afraid to act. The passengers whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads at the woman's behavior. Others leaned toward each other to discuss the pilot's boldness. A few even smiled at the girl, their eyes softening with compassion. For a brief moment, the tension in the cabin lifted, but no one knew what would happen next. The pilot turned to return to the cockpit, but just as he was about to step away, the girl whispered again, so softly, he barely heard it, "Thank you." He paused, looked back, and gave her a small nod. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was reassurance. Then he returned to his post. But the peace did not last long. About 30 minutes into the flight, the plane suddenly hit turbulence. The seatbelt signs lit up with a sharp ding, and the plane jolted so hard that several drinks spilled onto passengers' laps. People gasped, clutched the armrests, and some even screamed. The little girl gripped her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her backpack slid to the floor, and she quickly bent down to grab it, terrified of losing it. The racist woman beside her let out a loud cry, throwing her arms in the air. "Oh my God, we're going to crash!" she shouted, causing panic to ripple through the passengers. The flight attendants hurried down the aisle, calming everyone and instructing them to fasten their seatbelts. The plane shook again, harder this time, and luggage shifted in the overhead bins. One of the bins above the girls' row suddenly popped open. A heavy carry-on bag tumbled out, heading straight toward her small head. Gasps filled the cabin. In that instant, the racist woman, who had spent the entire time rejecting her, instinctively reached out. With surprising speed, she yanked the girl toward her chest just as the bag crashed onto the empty seat cushion where the girl had been sitting. The thud echoed through the cabin. The passengers stared in shock. The woman held the girl tightly, her breathing ragged, as if she hadn't even thought before acting. For the first time, her hands didn't tremble from anger but from fear. She looked down at the girl, her face pale, her eyes wide with realization. The girl looked up at her, confused but safe. The turbulence continued, though slightly less intense. The flight attendants managed to secure the bin and stow the bag away. Slowly, the plane steadied again, though the passengers' nerves remained rattled. The racist woman released the girl gently, her eyes darting around as if embarrassed that others had seen her act of protection. But she couldn't deny it. She had saved the very girl she didn't want beside her. The passengers who witnessed it whispered again, this time not about the pilot or the girl, but about the woman herself. Had she changed? Was it instinct? Or had the fear of death shown her something deeper? The girl hugged her backpack tightly once more, her young mind processing what had just happened. She didn't know if the woman truly cared, or if it was just a reaction, but in that moment, she had felt safe in her arms. But before anyone could settle into calm after the turbulence, Another sharp jolt rattled the plane. The seatbelt signs flickered, and the captain's voice came over the speakers, sounding more serious this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing heavier turbulence than expected. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The crew will stay seated as well. We're doing everything we can to ensure your safety. The passengers murmured in fear, clutching their seats tighter. And then it happened. Another extreme event that no one had expected. A sudden, loud bang echoed from the right wing of the plane. The sound was sharp, metallic, and frightening. The entire cabin gasped in unison. The plane dipped slightly, enough to make several people scream. The little girl clutched her seatbelt straps, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. The racist woman, now pale with fear, grabbed the armrest with one hand and the girl's arm with the other, no longer caring what anyone thought. The captain's voice returned, calm but with a tension he could not fully hide. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We've encountered a technical issue with the aircraft. We are handling it. Stay seated and trust us. But for the passengers, calm was impossible. Whispers of engine failure and "Are we going down?" spread quickly. Mothers clutched their children, men gritted their teeth in fear, and the once orderly cabin became a trembling sea of panic. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. She remembered the pilot's strong, assuring voice from earlier, but now she wasn't so sure. The racist woman's grip on her arm tightened. Her fear was raw, her earlier arrogance stripped away completely. She whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer, though no one could make out the words. And just as the cabin began to descend into complete chaos, the pilot's door opened again. The captain stepped out, his face composed but stern, and the passengers froze in silence once more. But this time, his expression told him something even more serious was about to unfold. The captain stepped out of the cockpit again, his tall figure filling the narrow aisle. His calm but stern face immediately silenced the cabin. The passengers' whispers died down like a flame snuffed out. All eyes turned to him, waiting, afraid, desperate to hear something that would ease their pounding hearts. The engines hummed steadily, but the echo of that loud bang still lingered in everyone's mind. People clutched their seatbelts tighter, their breaths shallow, as if the plane itself were hanging by a thread. The captain adjusted his cap and scanned the passengers with sharp eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was firm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, I need your cooperation. We've experienced a minor technical issue with the right wing. The situation is under control, but we must stay calm. Panic will not help us. Order will. He looked down the rows, his gaze landing briefly on the racist woman and the poor black girl seated together. The girl sat stiff, holding her backpack tightly to her chest, while the woman's face had gone pale, stripped of the pride she carried earlier. The pilot gave the girl a small nod, as if to silently promise her she was safe, then turned his attention back to passengers. Remain seated with your belts fastened. Trust my crew and me to do our job. The passengers nodded nervously. Some whispered prayers. Others clutched their loved ones. A little boy near the back began crying loudly, his mother rocking him as best she could, though her own face showed pure fear. The captain gave a final look around the cabin, then started back toward the cockpit. But before he disappeared inside, he paused again, as though something tugged at him. He turned and said, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing the right thing despite it. Remember that." Then the door shut behind him. The racist woman finally exhaled, her breath shaky. She glanced at the girl beside her, almost embarrassed by how tightly she had gripped her arm during the turbulence. Slowly, she released her hold. "You all right?" she asked quietly, almost in a whisper, as if afraid others might hear her showing kindness. The girl blinked in surprise. She wasn't sure if the woman truly cared, or if it was just the fear talking, but she nodded softly. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked away quickly, clearing her throat, trying to recover her old posture, but it was impossible. Everyone on that plane had seen her scream, panic, and cling to the child she once refused to sit beside. Her arrogance was cracking, piece by piece. Minutes passed. The plane steadied. The seatbelt sign remained on, but things felt calmer. Passengers leaned back in their seats, still tense, but less frantic. Some whispered about what could have caused a bang, others about the courage of the captain. The girl slowly reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn paperback book. Its cover was faded, the pages bent, clearly read many times before. She opened and tried to read, her small lips moving silently with the words. The woman beside her glanced at the book. "What's that?" she asked without thinking. The girl looked up, a little hesitant. "It's Charlotte's Web. My teacher gave it to me. She said it was special." The woman blinked. For some reason, that answer struck her. Her eyes softened for a moment before she caught herself and looked away. She muttered, pretending not to care. But deep inside, the simple innocence of the girl's answer tugged at something in her heart she didn't want to admit was there. For the next 20 minutes, the plane stayed steady. The passengers slowly began to breathe easier. A few even chuckled nervously, as if trying to convince themselves it was all going to be fine. One flight attendant, Sarah, walked through the aisle checking seatbelts, her warm smile calming passengers as she went. But then, without warning, the plane lurched again. A violent shudder rattled the cabin, stronger than before. The overhead lights flickered. A woman screamed from the back. Drinks spilled again, bags shifted, and the air grew thick with fear. The captain's voice came over the speaker, more serious than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are rerouting to the nearest airport for precaution. We will be landing earlier than planned." The whispers grew louder now. People muttered about emergency landings, about whether the wing would hold. The racist woman covered her mouth with her hand, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked at the girl again, who sat frozen, her small body trembling. Without thinking, the woman reached out again, this time more gently. "Don't worry. You'll be fine." The girl's wide eyes looked at her in surprise. "Are you scared?" The woman hesitated. For the first time in years, she didn't hide behind pride. She swallowed hard and whispered, "Yes, I'm terrified." The girl hugged her book tighter. "Me too." Another jolt interrupted their quiet exchange. This one was so sharp it caused a tray table to snap open, hitting the man in the next row on the knee. He yelped in pain. Passengers began crying out again. The flight attendants strapped themselves into their jump seats, their faces tight but professional. "Everyone remain seated," one of them shouted. Then came the sound that froze every soul on board, a high-pitched alarm from the cockpit, faint but unmistakable. It wailed like a siren through the thin door, sending a fresh wave of terror through the cabin. "What's happening?" someone yelled. "Are we going down?" The captain's voice did not come immediately. The seconds stretched painfully long. Finally, the intercom crackled. His voice was calm, but anyone listening closely could hear the tension in it. "We've lost partial control of the right engine. But listen to me. We are not falling. We are still in control. Trust me and my crew. Keep your belts fastened." Gasps swept through plane. Some passengers broke into sobs. A man pulled out a rosary and began praying loudly. Others whispered their own prayers under their breath. The little girl pressed her book against her chest like a shield. Her lips trembled as she whispered to herself, "Please, please let us land safe." The racist woman shut her eyes, muttering words no one could hear, her face drained of color. Her hand brushed against the girl's again, and this time she didn't pull it away. She held it. The girl blinked in shock, but didn't resist. For the first time, the woman's touch didn't feel harsh. It felt human. But just as the cabin began adjusting to the new fear, something even more extreme struck. The plane dropped suddenly, a sharp dip that sent stomachs lurching and passengers screaming. Oxygen masks tumbled from the ceiling, dangling above their heads like ghosts. The passengers panicked, reaching for the masks, fumbling with shaky hands. The little girl's small arms struggled to pull hers down. The woman beside her, forgetting all pride, grabbed it for her, placed it over her small face, and adjusted the straps. "Breathe, baby. Just breathe," she said, her voice breaking. The girl sucked in shaky breaths, the mask fogging slightly as she exhaled. The woman then pulled down her own mask, strapping it on, though her hand shook so badly she almost dropped it. The cabin was chaos, crying, screaming, prayers, flight attendants shouting instructions. The plane continued shaking, the oxygen masks swinging wildly with every jolt. The captain's voice came again, firmer now, cutting through the panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, stay calm. We are descending to a safer altitude. This is not a crash. This is a controlled descent. You are safe if you stay calm." His words fought against the fear, but the passengers' wide, terrified eyes showed how little comfort they truly felt. The racist woman gripped the girl's small hand tightly, her pride gone, her heart racing. The girl squeezed back, her young eyes looking up with a strange mixture of trust and fear. And then, just when the passengers thought it couldn't get worse, the captain's voice returned, this time sharper, urgent, and more alarming than ever before. "Brace positions. Everyone, get into brace positions now." The flight attendants shouted, "Heads down!" "Stay down," rushing to demonstrate. The entire cabin bent forward, pressing their heads against the seats in front of them. The little girl struggled to bend properly, but the woman wrapped her arm around her, pulling her close, covering her small body with her own. The passengers braced. The plane shuddered. The sound of the engines roared in their ears. And then, a deafening explosion ripped through the cabin. The right side of the plane jolted violently, and screams filled the air. Everything went dark. The explosion echoed to the cabin like thunder, rattling the very bones of every passenger on board. The lights flickered. The plane tilted and oxygen masks swung wildly as terrified screams filled the air. For a moment, it felt like the world itself was ripping apart. The little black girl squeezed her eyes shut, her small body trembling as the racist woman clutched her tightly, shielding her from the chaos. "Hold on, baby, just hold on," the woman cried, her voice raw with fear. The plane shook violently, dipping sharply before leveling again. Passengers sobbed, shouted prayers, and clung to one another. Some held hands across the aisle. Strangers suddenly bound together by the fear that this might be their last moments. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, louder than before but edged with urgency. "This is your captain speaking. We've had an engine failure on the right side. But listen carefully. We still have control of this plane. We are making an emergency landing. Stay calm. Stay in brace position when instructed." His words were meant to reassure, but for most passengers, they only deepened fear. The reality was clear. They were in real danger. The racist woman shook uncontrollably. Her pride and arrogance shattered completely. She held the girl, as if letting go would mean certain death. The girl's wide eyes darted around the cabin, watching as people cried, prayed, and begged for safety. One man shouted, "We're not going to make it." But a flight attendant quickly yelled back, her voice firm despite her trembling hands, "We are going to make it. Trust the captain. Trust us." The plane jolted again, dropping slightly before stabilizing. The sound of wind rushing outside the cabin was louder now, as though the damaged engine had torn something open. The air felt colder, sharper, and the tension was unbearable. The girl looked up at the woman, holding her. "Are we going to die?" she asked in a small, trembling voice. The woman's lips quivered. She wanted to lie, to say no, to promise safety. But she couldn't bring herself to give false hope. Instead, she squeezed the girl tighter and whispered, "We're going to hold on. That's what we're going to do. We hold on." The girl buried her face into the woman's shoulder, her little hands clutching the woman's arm. For the first time since the beginning of the flight, the two of them were connected, not by anger or prejudice, but by sheer survival. Minutes crawled by like hours. The captain announced again, "We are diverting to the nearest airport. Prepare yourselves. We'll be landing soon." Passengers clutched their masks, their belts, their loved ones. Some whispered names of family members, as if their voices could reach across the skies. Others kept their eyes shut, too afraid to look. The plane dipped again, sharper this time. Gasps filled the air. Suddenly, a small panel above row 16 broke loose and fell, hitting a man on the shoulder. He shouted in pain, clutching his arm. The flight attendants rushed to him, but the turbulence made it nearly impossible to move safely down the aisle. The woman glanced around, her eyes wide with fear. She muttered under her breath, "I can't believe this is happening." Then she looked at the girl again and added, "But don't you dare let go of me." The girl nodded quickly, clutching tighter. The turbulence eased slightly, but everyone knew it wasn't over. The cabin reeked of fear. Sweat, panic, and despair mingled in the air. A flight attendant, Sarah, stood briefly in the aisle, holding the seat back for support. "Everyone, listen. We are strong. We will land safely. Just keep calm and follow instructions. You're not alone." Her voice was steady, brave even in the face of chaos. A few passengers nodded, encouraged, while others continued sobbing. The girl whispered through her mask, "She's brave." The woman followed the girl's gaze and nodded faintly. "Yes, she is." Then, almost reluctantly, she added, "You're brave, too." The girl blinked, surprised by the words. "Me?" The woman gave a small, tight smile. "Yes, you. Sitting through all this, you're braver than half the adults here." The girl didn't know how to respond. No one had ever told her she was brave before. She held on to those words, letting them warm her even as the cabin shook again. Suddenly, the intercom crackled once more. The captain's voice was louder now, urgent but controlled. "Brace, brace, brace. Heads down, stay down." The flight attendants echoed his words loudly, shouting, "Heads down, stay down. Brace positions, everyone." The passengers bent forward, pressing their heads into the seats in front of them. The little girl struggled, but the woman guided her quickly, covering her with her own body again. The plane tilted, descended sharply, and the engines roared like thunder. The sound of metal straining under pressure filled the cabin, making hearts pound faster. The girl whimpered, her small body shaking. The woman whispered, "Shoo, I've got you. I've got you." And then it happened. The plane lurched violently to the side, throwing several passengers against their seatbelts. One overhead bin burst open, and a suitcase tumbled into the aisle with a loud crash. People screamed. The girl cried out, and the woman held her tighter, refusing to let go. Through the small windows, flashes of lights could be seen, city lights below. They were close to the ground. Too close, too fast. The captain's voice thundered one last time, "Brace for impact." The passengers screamed, prayed, and pressed into their seats. The girl shut her eyes tightly, clutching the woman's arm. The woman whispered, "Hold on, hold on." And then a blinding flash of light burst through the windows. A violent jolt shook the plane so hard that oxygen masks snapped against faces and luggage flew down the aisle. The sound of screeching metal filled the cabin. The plane slammed against something. Sparks flew outside the windows. The passengers screamed louder than ever. And then silence. Total silence. No one knew if it was over. The airplane felt heavier with silence than it did with all its passengers combined. No one moved. No one whispered. All eyes stayed locked on Captain Harris as he stood in the narrow aisle, his broad shoulders nearly brushing both sides of the plane. His face carried the weight of authority, but his voice, steady, firm, and deliberate, cut through the thick tension. "Everyone deserves respect on this plane," he said, his eyes sweeping from the front row to the very back. "That includes this young girl right here." He motioned toward Aaliyah, whose small body seemed even smaller in the oversized airplane seat. The racist woman who had caused all the commotion, Mrs. Whitfield, sat rigid, her lips pressed so tightly together they looked like a single pale line. Her eyes darted from Captain Harris to the passengers around her, but she refused to speak. For the first time since she'd boarded, she didn't look like the one in control. Then came the twist that stunned everyone. Captain Harris turned slightly and said in a voice that carried both pride and certainty, "This girl, Aaliyah, she's not just a passenger. She's someone I know." Gasps rippled through the cabin. People leaned closer, straining to hear every word. Mrs. Whitfield blinked hard, her mouth opening just a little as if to protest, but the pilot raised his hand slightly to silence her. "Years ago," he continued, "I met her in the most unexpected way, and I'll never forget it. The story was about to unravel, But before he could share more, a sudden ding from the overhead system interrupted the moment. The seatbelt light flashed, and turbulence jolted the plane violently. Drinks spilled, trays rattled, and gasps of fear replaced the earlier murmurs of curiosity. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic. The plane shook again, harder this time, forcing Captain Harris to grab the overhead bin to steady himself. The flight attendants moved quickly, urging passengers to buckle up. A child cried out in fear from somewhere near the back. The calm storytelling moment was shattered by the unpredictability of the skies. For nearly 5 minutes, the turbulence tossed the airplane like a toy in the wind. People clutched the armrests, whispered frantic prayers, and looked to the crew for reassurance. Aaliyah shut her eyes tightly, holding her backpack to her chest as though it could protect her. Then, as suddenly as it started, the turbulence eased. The seatbelt light remained on, but the shaking slowed to nothing more than occasional bumps. The cabin filled with nervous laughter and shaky sighs of relief. But Captain Harris didn't sit back down. He stayed where he was, still holding the overhead bin with one hand, looking directly at Aaliyah. "You all just felt it," he said. "How quickly things can change. How powerless we can be up here. And yet in moments like that, the only thing that matters is that we hold on together." His words weren't just about the turbulence. They carried a double meaning, and many passengers knew it. Mrs. Whitfield shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly realizing she was losing support from those around her. The tension of the turbulence was a high moment, but what followed was calmer, though no less powerful. Captain Harris began to speak again, his voice softer this time. "When I first met Aaliyah," he said, "she wasn't sitting on a plane. She was sitting on a sidewalk." A hush fell over passengers. Even the crying child in the back seemed to quiet, as though sensing the gravity of his words. "I was in uniform that day," Harris went on, "not as a pilot, but as a man who had just walked away from a funeral of someone I served with. I was heavy with grief, barely paying attention to where I was going. Then I saw her." He nodded toward Aaliyah. A little girl with no shoes, holding a piece of cardboard with words she had written in her own handwriting. Hungry but hopeful. Gasps spread across the cabin. Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears, not because she was embarrassed, but because she remembered. The memory of those cold days was still carved deep into her. The passengers leaned in closer, captivated. "I stopped," Harris said firmly, "because that sign broke me. Because even in her pain, that word, hopeful, stood out. I asked her name. She told me. And from that moment on, I knew I couldn't just walk past." The cabin was silent except for the hum of the engines. Mrs. Whitfield muttered under her breath, "This is ridiculous." But her voice was drowned out by the sheer weight of Harris's words. She reminded me that sometimes we have nothing but each other. Sometimes all we can give is kindness. And that's why no one on this plane, no one in this world, should ever be treated as less than. The passengers erupted in applause. It wasn't a polite clapping of people ready for a show to end. It was loud, genuine, and long. People clapped until their hands stung. Aaliyah's cheeks flushed as she looked around, overwhelmed. For the first time in her young life, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the poor girl, to be looked down upon. She was someone worth hearing about, someone worth defending. The applause eventually died down, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. What once felt hostile and divided now felt united. The passengers exchanged glances, nods, and even small smiles with one another. But the calm couldn't last forever. Just as it seemed like things might finally settle, Mrs. Whitfield stood up abruptly, ignoring the seatbelt sign. Her face was red with anger, her hands trembling as she pointed directly at Captain Harris. "This is nonsense," she snapped, her voice shrill and sharp. "You're just trying to make her look good. She's nothing but a—" The word caught in her throat, but everyone knew what she had been about to say. Gasps echoed across the cabin. Captain Harris stepped forward quickly, his hand raised, not to threaten her, but to stop her. His voice boomed louder than before. "Sit down." The command left no room for argument. But Mrs. Whitfield didn't sit. Instead, she lunged toward Aaliyah, pointing at her directly. "She doesn't belong here." I won't sit next to her, and I won't fly on the same plane with her. Do you hear me?" The passengers froze. No one had expected her rage to go this far. But then, in the middle of her rant, something shocking happened. Something that pulled the entire plane into yet another storm of suspense. Mrs. Whitfield's face went pale, her hands clutching her chest. She staggered backward, her eyes wide with panic. Gasps filled the cabin once more. And then she collapsed in the aisle. The entire plane erupted in screams. Chaos erupted inside the airplane the moment Mrs. Whitfield hit the floor. Her body sprawled across the narrow aisle, her arms stiff at awkward angles. The sound of passengers screaming filled the cabin, overlapping with the frantic dinging of the call buttons being pressed all at once. "Someone help her!" a man in row 12 shouted, his voice breaking through the noise. The flight attendant sprang into action. Jessica, the lead attendant, hurried down the aisle, dropping to her knees beside the unconscious woman. Her professional composure barely masked the tension in her voice as she called out, "Does anyone here have medical training? A doctor? A nurse?" Several heads turned. For a moment, no one moved. Then a man in his late 40s raised his hand. "I'm a paramedic," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt and squeezing past his row. Passengers shifted their legs to give him space as he rushed toward the scene. Captain Harris stayed standing, though his training told him to return to the cockpit during emergencies. But he couldn't, not now. He crouched low, close to Jessica and the paramedic. Aaliyah sat frozen in her seat, her small hands gripping her backpack, so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She couldn't look away from the sight of Mrs. Whitfield lying there. Only minutes ago, this woman had shouted hateful words at her, and now she looked fragile, weak, human. The paramedic pressed 2 fingers against Mrs. Whitfield's neck. "She's got a pulse," he said, though his voice was clipped and serious. "But it's weak. Looks like cardiac distress." Jessica nodded quickly, grabbing the medical kit stored near the front. Another flight attendant rushed forward with a portable oxygen mask. Passengers craned their necks, some whispering, others praying quietly. The scene was extreme, the kind of moment no one forgets. The paramedic leaned closer, tilting Mrs. Whitfield's head back and checking her breathing. "We need to stabilize her until we land," he said firmly. "How long until we can divert?" Captain Harris glanced toward the cockpit, his pilot instincts kicking in. He didn't want to leave, but he knew he had to make a decision. "I'll check with ATC," he said quickly. He turned toward Jessica. "Keep me updated." As he moved back toward the front, the passengers whispered even louder. Some were shaken, others confused. And Aaliyah, she just sat there, staring at the woman who had called her unworthy only minutes before. Her mind swirled with questions. Should I feel sorry for her? Should I care after what she said to me? Her chest felt heavy, as though the turbulence had returned inside her. The calm part of the moment unfolded slowly. The paramedic worked methodically, attaching the oxygen mask to Mrs. Whitfield's face, making sure it was secure. Jessica placed a blanket beneath her head to keep it steady. The other attendants moved to the cabin, urging passengers to remain calm and seated. But calm didn't mean easy. The atmosphere had shifted again, no longer filled with anger, but with uncertainty, fear, unease. Aaliyah's thoughts ran wild. She remembered the way Mrs. Whitfield's voice had cracked with rage. She remembered how those words had burned like fire. But now, she also saw how frail the woman looked lying on the cold floor of the airplane. She leaned closer to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, and whispered to herself, "Why does it feel so hard to hate her now?" Meanwhile, Captain Harris entered the cockpit, his voice calm but urgent as he radioed air traffic control. "We've got a medical emergency on board. Passenger collapsed. Possible cardiac arrest. Requesting immediate diversion." The controllers quickly rerouted them to the nearest airport. Harris glanced at the co-pilot, who was already adjusting their course. His face was stone hard, but deep inside, Harris felt the weight of everything. Not just the responsibility of the flight, but the responsibility of the little girl in row 7, the one who had been humiliated before everyone, the one who was now forced to witness her tormentor's downfall in real time. Back in the cabin, minutes dragged like hours. The paramedic kept checking vitals. Mrs. Whitfield's breathing was shallow but present. Oxygen flowed to the mask, helping her stabilize, though she hadn't regained consciousness. Passengers spoke in hushed tones. Some expressed sympathy, others skepticism. "She was so cruel to that girl," one woman whispered. "Now look at her." Another man frowned. "No one deserves this, though. Not even her." The whispers carried forward and backward, bouncing around the cabin like restless ghosts. Aaliyah heard some of it, but she stayed silent. She didn't know what to feel, and that silence was heavier than any word she could have spoken. Then something shifted again, another climb toward the extreme. Mrs. Whitfield's hand twitched. Her body jolted slightly, startling Jessica and the paramedic. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and glassy. She gasped against the oxygen mask, her chest heaving. Everyone leaned in closer. The paramedic adjusted the mask quickly. "Easy now, ma'am. You're okay. You collapsed, but we got you stable." Her eyes darted wildly, searching faces until they landed on one, Aaliyah, and then, shockingly, she tried to pull the mask away. Her lips moved, straining to form words. "No!" she croaked, her voice raspy. Not beside her. The cabin froze. The paramedic pressed the mask firmly back onto her face. "Don't talk, ma'am. Save your strength." But the damage was done. Even in her frailty, even as she hovered on the edge of life and death, Mrs. Whitfield had chosen to cling to her prejudice. Gasps filled the air again. A few passengers shook their heads in disbelief. One woman muttered, "Unbelievable!" Aaliyah's eyes widened. For a moment, she thought she might cry, but instead, she felt something else, something steadier, resolve. She realized that this moment wasn't about what Mrs. Whitfield said. It was about who she, Aaliyah, chose to be in response. She sat up straighter, lifted her chin, and whispered softly, almost to herself, "I'm not moving. I belong here." Captain Harris returned to the cabin just in time to hear those words. He locked eyes with her, giving a subtle nod of approval. Then he addressed everyone. "We're diverting to the nearest airport. Emergency medical personnel will be waiting when we land. In the meantime, stay calm." Passengers nodded, reassured by his presence, but their eyes kept drifting toward Mrs. Whitfield, her frail body, her hateful words, and the undeniable truth that no one knew whether she would survive the landing. The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed. The tension remained thick, heavy, unshakable. Everyone felt suspended, not just in the air, but in the uncertainty of what would happen next. Minutes passed like hours. The plane descended through thick clouds, the cabin dim with the overhead lights. Aaliyah pressed her hands together, whispering prayers she wasn't sure Mrs. Whitfield deserved, but prayers she couldn't stop herself from saying. And then, just as the runway lights appeared in the distance, the calm shattered again. Mrs. Whitfield's body jerked violently. Her chest stopped rising. The paramedic's voice turned sharp and commanding. "She's not breathing." The passengers gasped as a paramedic launched into CPR right there in the aisle, his hands pumping against her chest while Jessica counted aloud. The sound of compressions mixed with the desperate hum of the engines and the collective fear of everyone on board. The plane was seconds from landing, but inside, life itself hung by a thread. "Chest compressions, now!" the paramedic barked, his voice urgent, cutting to the hum of the engines. Jessica, the lead attendant, counted in sharp bursts. 1, 2, 3 for her voice trembled, but her rhythm stayed steady as the paramedic pressed hard against Mrs. Whitfield's chest. Passengers leaned into the aisle, wide-eyed and horrified. No one blinked. No one breathed. It was as if the entire cabin had been sucked into a bubble of silence, broken only by the sound of compressions and the oxygen hissing through the mask. Aaliyah clutched her backpack to her chest, so tightly it almost hurt. She couldn't look away. Just minutes ago, Mrs. Whitfield had called her unworthy, had insisted she didn't belong. And now she was lying lifeless on the floor, her chest rising and falling only through the desperate efforts of strangers. The plane jolted suddenly as the landing gear dropped into place. Gasps echoed again, but the paramedic didn't pause. He kept pumping. Come on, he muttered, sweat forming on his brow. 10 more seconds until touchdown. Captain Harris shouted from the front, his voice booming over the chaos. His focus was split between the cockpit and the cabin, but his heart weighed heavily on what was unfolding behind him. The pressure inside the cabin was unbearable. The lives of every passenger depended on the pilots guiding the plane safely to ground, but one life, the most fragile, depended on a man kneeling in the aisle. The wheels screeched against the runway. The cabin shook violently. Drinks toppled. Bags shifted. But the paramedic never stopped. His hands pressed down, over and over, fighting against time. "Clear!" he shouted, as Jessica handed him the automated external defibrillator from the emergency kit. He tore open Mrs. Whitfield's blouse just enough to place the pads. The device beeped, analyzing. "Do not touch the patient," it said in its robotic tone. Passengers held their breath. A second later, the device's voice spoke again. "Shock advised." Jessica's hands shook as she pressed a button. A sharp jolt coursed through Mrs. Whitfield's body, making it spasm violently. Gasps and cries filled the cabin, some passengers covering their mouths, others gripping the seats in front of them. "Come on," the paramedic whispered. "Come back." For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, faint, shallow, her chest rose on its own. "She's got a pulse," the paramedic shouted. Relief rippled across the cabin, but it was cautious, tentative. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes fluttered, half opening, then closing again. Her breaths were weak, irregular, but they were hers. The plane slowed as it taxied down the runway, emergency vehicles already flashing their lights outside. The relief among the passengers was mixed with exhaustion. Some sighed loudly. Others leaned back in their seats as though they had been holding their bodies rigid through the entire ordeal. But the calm that followed wasn't pure. It was uneasy. The scene had left everyone shaken, and Mrs. Whitfield's faint recovery didn't erase the memory of her words. Aaliyah's heart raced, her small hands trembling. She had prayed silently through the ordeal, though she hadn't even known what words to use. Now she just stared. She couldn't bring herself to feel relief or anger. She only felt confused. Captain Harris stood near the cockpit door, steadying himself against the wall as he looked at the cabin. His voice carried reassurance, though his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. "We've landed safely. Medical personnel are waiting just outside. Please remain seated until we instruct otherwise." The paramedic kept his hands on Mrs. Whitfield's wrist, monitoring her pulse. Jessica held the oxygen mask firmly in place. The seconds stretched long as the plane slowed to a stop. Outside the windows, flashing red and white lights painted the night sky. The faint sound of sirens reached the cabin. The plane stopped, brakes squealing. The front door opened quickly, the boarding bridge already attached. Within moments, paramedics in bright uniforms stormed the aisle with a stretcher. Passengers shifted their legs, some standing to make way. Jessica and the onboard paramedic gave quick updates, their words blending into a blur of medical jargon. Mrs. Whitfield was carefully lifted onto the stretcher, her body frail and still, her breath shallow. The passengers watched in silence as she was wheeled out, disappearing into flashing lights outside. The calm after her exit was strange, like the silence that follows thunder. Passengers looked at each other, processing everything they had just witnessed. Some whispered quietly, others stared straight ahead. And Aaliyah? She sat perfectly still, her heart thudding so loudly she thought others could hear it. Her mind swirled with contradictions. Part of her had wanted Mrs. Whitfield gone, removed from her life forever. But another part of her, the part that remembered hunger and loneliness, felt a sting of pity. She hates me, Aaliyah thought, but I couldn't hate her back, even when I tried. Jessica moved down the aisle, her voice calm and steady. "We'll be on the ground here for a while. Please remain in your seats until further notice." Some passengers nodded. Others sighed. A few pulled out their phones, desperate to share the unbelievable story with the world outside. But no one dared to disturb Aaliyah. She remained a silent figure, her gaze fixed on the floor. Minutes passed. The flashing lights outside faded as the stretcher disappeared into the distance. Slowly, normalcy began to creep back into the cabin. The hum of the engine softened. The air conditioning hummed quietly, and passengers shifted in their seats, whispering about food, connections, and delays. But calm didn't mean closure. Far from it. Captain Harris stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be here on the ground for some time as we complete the necessary reports and prepare for the next leg of our journey. I appreciate your cooperation." The passengers murmured, some clapping politely, but Captain Harris's eyes weren't on them. They were on Aaliyah. He walked down the aisle slowly, stopping beside her seat. He crouched slightly so he could meet her eyes. "You doing okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, though the motion was small and hesitant. He lowered his voice. "What you went through today, most adults couldn't handle that kind of cruelty. But you held your head high. That takes strength." Aaliyah blinked, her lips parting as if to answer, but no words came. Instead, she gave him a faint, grateful smile. Passengers nearby listened quietly. Some nodded in agreement. Others smiled encouragingly at the little girl who had endured so much. For a brief moment, the plane felt united again, not because of shared fear, but because of shared admiration. But calm moments never lasted long on this flight. Just as passengers began to settle, a new sound filled the cabin. The captain's radio, clipped to his belt, crackled to life with a message from outside. His brow furrowed as he listened, his expression tightening. "What is it?" Jessica asked softly. He didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. Finally, he looked up, his voice low but grim. "The hospital just radioed in. Mrs. Whitfield coded again on the way there. They're fighting to bring her back." Gasps rippled across the cabin. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, whispers buzzing like static. Aaliyah's stomach dropped. Her hands tightened around her backpack once more, and as the weight of the words sank in, Captain Harris added quietly, "And she asked for someone before she lost consciousness again." The entire cabin leaned in. Jessica swallowed. "Who?" Captain Harris's eyes shifted toward Aaliyah. Passengers turned, one by one, their gazes landing on the young girl. The silence was deafening. The cabin fell silent. The hum of the engine seemed louder than the voices that had gone quiet. Every passenger turned their head toward Aaliyah, the small girl who just minutes ago had been treated like she didn't belong. Now, Captain Harris's words hung in the air. Mrs. Whitfield asked for someone, and it was her. Gasps filled the cabin. Some passengers frowned, confused. Others raised their brows, shocked. The whispers began almost immediately. "Why would she ask the girl?" One woman muttered. "She hated her." We all heard it. Another said, "Jessica, the lead flight attendant," glanced at Aaliyah with wide eyes. She knelt beside her seat. "Honey, did you hear that?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with surprise. Aaliyah nodded slowly, her lips pressed together. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum. She couldn't understand it either. Why would a woman who had insulted her so harshly call for her while fighting for her life? "I don't want to go," Aaliyah whispered finally, shaking her head. "She doesn't like me." Captain Harris crouched down to her level. His voice was gentle but firm. "I know this is confusing, but sometimes, when people are close to losing everything, the truth inside them comes out. Maybe, just maybe she wanted to say something only you can hear." The passengers leaned in, the weight of the moment pulling them closer. They weren't just watching anymore. They were invested in every word, every breath. Jessica touched Aaliyah's hand. "You don't have to decide right now," she said kindly. "You're safe here." The calm that followed was thick with questions. The passengers whispered to each other, each offering theories. Maybe she regrets what she said. Or maybe she just wants to apologize. Or maybe it's guilt. Aaliyah sat quietly, hugging her backpack. Her mind swirled. Part of her wanted to say no, to refuse to be dragged into the life of a woman who had treated her like dirt. But another part, a small but powerful part, felt the weight of curiosity. What if she really does want to tell me something? Captain Harris stood, addressing the cabin. For now, we'll remain here until further instructions from ground control. Please stay seated. He returned to the cockpit, his shoulders heavy. The responsibility of his passengers was one thing. The responsibility of the girl was another. He couldn't stop thinking about how strange it was. Of all the names in the world, Mrs. Whitfield had spoken Aaliyah's. The cabin settled into uneasy calm. Some passengers pulled out snacks. Others scrolled their phones. But no one forgot what had just been said. Their eyes kept darting back to Aaliyah. She was no longer just another passenger. She was part of the mystery. Aaliyah leaned against a window, staring at the flashing lights outside. She thought about her mom, how she always told her that kindness was stronger than anger. She thought about the cardboard sign she once held on the sidewalk. Hungry but hopeful. Hopeful. Could hope really mean forgiving someone like Mrs. Whitfield? Her stomach churned. Jessica came back with a cup of water. Here, she said softly, placing it in Aaliyah's hands. Drink a little. You've been through a lot. Aaliyah nodded and took a sip, her small fingers trembling against the plastic cup. She didn't say anything, but Jessica gave her an encouraging smile before stepping away. Minutes dragged on like hours. The calm grew heavy. Passengers whispered theories, some supportive, some skeptical. A few muttered that maybe Mrs. Whitfield didn't deserve forgiveness. Others said it might be her last chance to say something meaningful. Then the captain's radio crackled again. The voice of ground control was sharp, urgent. Harris listened, his expression turning grim. He unhooked the radio and stepped back into the cabin. The passengers watched closely. His face told them everything. They knew something had changed. She's gone into cardiac arrest again, he said quietly. They're trying to revive her. She's still asking for Aaliyah. The cabin froze. Every head turned toward the little girl. Aaliyah's eyes went wide, her chest tightening. She's still asking? She whispered. Harris nodded. Yes. She called your name again. The whispers turned into a wave. The passengers weren't just shocked now. They were captivated. Why would a racist woman, second from death, call out to the very girl she had insulted? Jessica touched Aaliyah's shoulder. Honey, do you think you want to see her? If the doctors let you? Aaliyah shook her head quickly. No, she was mean to me. I know, Jessica said gently, and you don't have to. But sometimes people say things at the end they never said in life. The calmness of the explanation didn't soothe Aaliyah. It only made her chest feel heavier. Captain Harris crouched down again, his voice low. Listen, Aaliyah, you don't have to go. But if you do, you might hear something that changes everything. And no matter what she says, it won't change who you are. Aaliyah blinked back tears. She didn't answer. The passengers sat in silence, watching. Every one of them felt the tension crawling under their skin. This wasn't just about one girl and one woman anymore. It was about dignity, forgiveness, the strange, unpredictable way life twists in the air like turbulence. And then, just when it seemed the cabin had reached its limit, the radio crackled again. Harris raised it to his ear, his face pale. This time, his voice trembled when he spoke. They've managed to stabilize her again. But the doctors say, he paused, swallowing hard. They say she may not make it through the night. The cabin gasped in unison, and then he added one final blow, his words dropping like a stone into the silence. They're asking if Aaliyah will come to the hospital, because if Mrs. Whitfield has anything left to say, she wants to say it to her. The entire plane fell into stunned silence. Aaliyah's hands shook around her backpack. She looked up at Captain Harris, her voice barely more than a whisper. What if I don't want to hear it? Passengers leaned forward, desperate to know her answer. The decision hung in the air like the plane itself, suspended, fragile, uncertain. The terminal at the city hospital was bright, sterile, and filled with the echo of hurried footsteps. Aaliyah held tightly to Jessica's hand as they walked through the automatic glass doors. Captain Harris walked just behind them, carrying his cap under his arm. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. It had been less than an hour since they left the plane, but the weight of what awaited them pressed heavier with every step. The doctors had been clear. Mrs. Whitfield was slipping away. If she had something left to say, she wanted to say it to Aaliyah. The hospital staff guided them to the cardiac unit. A nurse, middle-aged and serious, stopped them outside the door. "She's weak," the nurse said quietly. "Her heart isn't holding up. She keeps repeating the same thing. She wants to see the girl." Her eyes softened as she looked at Aaliyah. "Are you ready?" Aaliyah froze. She looked up at Jessica, her lip trembling. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Jessica knelt down. "You don't have to," she said. "But if you do, you'll never have to wonder what she wanted to tell you." Captain Harris added gently, "Sometimes the hardest thing is to walk through a door we don't want to, but if you do, you'll walk back out stronger." Aaliyah thought about her mom. She thought about the times people ignored them on the street when they were homeless. She thought about the shame of being told she didn't belong in first class. And she thought about the chance to hear something, anything, that might make sense of it all. Finally, she nodded. "I'll go." The nurse opened the door. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of machines. Beeping monitors tracked fragile heartbeats. Mrs. Whitfield lay in the bed, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Tubes ran into her arms, and wires connected her chest to the monitors. Her eyes opened slowly when she heard the door. At first, they looked glassy, distant. Then they focused, and when they did, they landed on Aaliyah. The room was so quiet that the beep of the monitor felt like thunder. Mrs. Whitfield's lips parted. Her voice was faint, raspy. "You came." Aaliyah didn't move. She stood frozen near the doorway, clutching her backpack straps. Jessica gave her a small nod of encouragement from the hall. Harris remained outside, respecting the privacy. Aaliyah stepped closer, her shoes squeaking against the floor. She stopped at the side of the bed, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Mrs. Whitfield's breathing was labored. She raised a trembling hand, motioning weakly. "Closer, please." Against every instinct, Aaliyah stepped forward until she was right by the bedside. The old woman's voice cracked. "I need to say this before it's too late." Aaliyah didn't answer. She just listened. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes glistened with tears. "I treated you badly. On that plane, I said things, hateful things. I wanted to hurt you, because all my life I carried hate. My parents, they taught me to despise. I passed it down. I believed it made me strong. But all it made me was empty." Her chest rose and fell sharply. The monitor beeped faster. A nurse glanced in but didn't intervene. Aaliyah's throat tightened. She whispered, "Why me? Why did you call my name?" Tears rolled down Mrs. Whitfield's cheeks. "Because when I looked at you, I saw myself, not as I am, but as I could have been, pure, untainted, full of hope. I knew I ruined my life with hate. But maybe if I told you, you wouldn't let the same poison in." The words stung. They didn't erase the insults. They didn't undo the humiliation. But they cracked something deeper, a glimpse of a woman who, for the first time, wasn't hiding behind her cruelty. Her hand reached weakly toward Aaliyah. "Forgive me, child." Aaliyah's small hand shook. She thought about everything, the insults, the pain, the shame. And then she thought about her mom's words. Kindness is stronger than anger. She didn't know if she could forgive fully. But she also knew she didn't want to carry hate in her own heart. She placed her hand gently over Mrs. Whitfield's. "I don't hate you," she whispered. Mrs. Whitfield's chest rose sharply. Her lips trembled. And then, for the first time in years, she smiled. A fragile, broken smile. The monitor beeped slower. Her eyes closed. And just like that, the room went silent. The nurse stepped forward, checked her pulse, and then looked at Aaliyah. She spoke softly. "She's gone." Aaliyah froze, her hand still on the old woman's. Jessica hurried in, wrapping her arms around the girl. "You were brave," she whispered. "Braver than most adults I've ever met." Captain Harris entered quietly, his face solemn. He looked at the still figure on the bed, then at Aaliyah. "She chose you," he said simply, "and you gave her peace." Aaliyah didn't respond. Her mind was spinning. She didn't know if she felt relief, sadness, or confusion. Maybe all at once. The staff gave them time, then gently guided them out. The door closed behind them, leaving the room in silence. By the time they returned to the airport, the news had spread. Reporters crowded near the gate, cameras flashing. Passengers on the flight had already told the story. The little girl who was insulted was the last person the dying woman wanted to see. Questions flew from every direction. Why did she call your name? What did she say to you? Did she apologize? Aaliyah clutched Jessica's hand tighter. She didn't answer. Captain Harris raised his hand firmly. No questions. The child has been through enough. Respect her privacy. His voice carried authority, silencing the reporters. Jessica guided Aaliyah through the crowd. Passengers watched in awe, some with tears in their eyes. A few even applauded softly, not out of spectacle, but out of respect. Later, sitting in a quiet lounge, Jessica knelt in front of Aaliyah again. "You don't have to tell anyone what she said," she said. "That moment was yours. Yours alone." Aaliyah nodded slowly. She stared out the window at the runway, where planes took off into the night sky. She whispered, almost to herself, she was scared. She didn't want to be remembered for hate. Jessica's eyes softened. "And because of you, she won't be." Captain Harris joined them, setting his cap on the table. "Aaliyah, you've been through something people spend their whole lives avoiding, facing hatred head-on. And instead of letting it change you, you showed mercy. That strength most adults don't have." Aaliyah looked down at her hands. For the first time since the flight began, she felt calm. Weeks later, newspapers ran the story. Not just of Mrs. Whitfield's death, but the girl she called for. The headlines varied. Dying woman calls out the girl she once insulted. Forgiveness in the sky, a final lesson. Little girl shows the world the power of grace. Aaliyah didn't read the papers. She didn't need to. For her, the moment wasn't about headlines. It was about a choice, to carry hate or to let it go. And though she was only a child, she knew she had made the right choice. When she closed her eyes at night, she still saw the old woman's fragile smile. A smile that might never have existed if she had refused to walk through that hospital door. She whispered to herself, just as her mom had once whispered, kindness is stronger than anger. And for the first time since the journey began, she believed it with all her heart. The passengers eventually went back to their lives. The plane flew again. The world kept turning. But everyone who was there on that flight carried something with them, a memory of the day when a child reminded them that humanity is measured not by wealth, not by class, not by hate, but by mercy. And for Aaliyah, the girl who once begged for food with a cardboard sign, it was the beginning of a new kind of strength. Not the strength of survival, but the strength of forgiveness. The sky was quiet that night, but in its silence, a lesson remained. Hate fades, anger burns out, but kindness endures. And that brings us to the end of this powerful story. What began as a flight filled with division and prejudice ended with a lesson the entire world can learn from. Kindness is stronger than anger, and forgiveness can heal wounds that hate never could. But the question remains, if you were in Aaliyah's shoes, would you have shown the same grace? Or would the pain of her words have been too much to forgive? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Until then, remember, every act of kindness leaves a mark that outlives hate.